peace, family. Oh man, we gonna get into it today on this Fourth of July European holiday that we've been conditioned to celebrate. As you know, as we hold on, turn this off. You know, as we've been conditioned to celebrate, um, the more and more we come into knowledge and come into knowledge of self, we start understanding the true history of the Negroes here in the Americas and across the diaspora. Now, a lot of things, hey Penny, a lot of things that was taught to us in school didn't reflect the true knowledge of who we were, the true knowledge of who our ancestry were. Now, I hear a lot of disrespect of soldiers that fought in the wars. I hear a lot of, I would use the term ignorance, not in the term of disrespect, but in terms of just not understanding the proper history of what our people been through and understanding slavery and understanding how colonies were created in Sierra Leone, in Liberia, Trinidad, what our people think. Thanks, Voice of Reason, for putting the Cash App thing in there. A Penny, Mimi. We got who else? We got Kenny Conjo, as always. Little Narm, the James Turnip Seed, Bar Dog D. So yeah, we got them coming in. But on this 4th of July, I want to do a presentation on the effects of the Revolutionary War and how it affected Negro people, how colonies was created in Canada, how a lot of our people back in the 1700s got to Canada. And what I'm going to do today, I'm going to hurt some feelings. Because even though I'm a supporter of ADOS, some of the rhetoric in the ADOS conversation where we begin to talk terms as if Caribbean people and African Americans are not the same. I'm going to smash that out today. I'm going to destroy that ignorance as if black folks over in London are not the same. We're going to destroy all of that today. And you're going to get a chance to see how us fighting in these wars for our liberation move the so-called African Americans around the country and around the diaspora. So 200 years later, you begin to see that we're all the same people. We've been conditioned to see ourselves as something different. Somebody in Jamaica, somebody in Trinidad, some people, black people over in Canada, the African Americans in Louisiana, the African Americans in Pennsylvania. We're all looking at ourselves as something different. But we don't know the true history. We don't understand the wars that we fought in the War of 1812, the Revolutionary War, the Spanish-American War. We don't know our history. We really don't know. We really don't understand the magnitude of those wars and how it played on the psyche and the cultures of our people. So they took people from South Carolina. They took people from Virginia, Delaware, Georgia, Texas. All these different regiments began to join the British Army because the British told the slaves that anybody that fight with us during the Revolutionary War can obtain freedom. So thousands of so-called African Americans joined regiments and created regiments to fight against the Patriots with the promise of freedom. The promise of freedom. The promise to be taken to Canada, and some went to Florida, which was a free place. Some went to Jamaica. Some, and after 1812, went to Trinidad, which was called the Americans. Not Americans, Americans. Thousands went to Trinidad. Some were sent back because of poor conditions and the cold climate in Canada to Sierra Leone, which is now today known as Freetown. Also Mexico as well, as absolutely. But yet and still, we, through our ignorance, we have the audacity to say we're different people. And this is why we're powerless in the diaspora, because we're feeding right into the hands of the enemy. We got the ADOS movement. We got the reparations conversation that's been around for a long time. We got CARICOM. But yet and still, with all the history of our people and what they fought for to liberate us, we're walking around thinking we're British. We're walking around thinking we're French. We're walking around talking about something. I'm American. Fuck Africa. I'm American. They set you up. They set you up, man. We don't understand our history. So today, on this 4th of July, I'm going to do a stream that I know you're not going to get from most people. That's going to give you understanding of why we fought in these wars. When you're a slave and you have to fight, and they offering you freedom, and you're a slave. You're gonna take the best options that you have in order to liberate your people and the generations that come behind them. So shout out to the black soldiers who fought on the British side in efforts to gain some type of dignity and respect for our people. Fuck the Patriots and the Allied forces. So what we're going to do, we're going to get right off into it. We're going to share the screen and we're going to go to work today. They call them the Black Loyalists. The Black Loyalists. Hey, grandbaby. They called them the Black Loyalists. And the Black Loyalists were people that was loyal to the British Crown. Now, I'm not saying that the white British liked the fact that you had black soldiers, because they didn't. The British was just as racist as the Patriots. But when you are a slave and you are seeking independence and some form of dignity as a man, you're going to take the best hand that will be given to you, where you can have a chance to have some type of freedom and pass it down to the generations to come. And this is the role that our ancestors were thrust into. So let's share the screen. Let's get off into it. All right. So we'll get into the ex-slaves who fought with the British, and you get a chance to see a depiction of a slave in the red coats as he begins to engage in warfare against his former slave masters. What's going on, Picasso? Let's go down. When American colonists took up arms in the battle for independence, started in 1775, the fight for freedom excluded an entire race of people. Now, I want y'all, now that's important, because it says when American colonists took up arms in battle for independence, started in 1775, the fight for freedom excluded an entire race of people. Now, here you have the colonists fighting for independence against the British Crown, but at the same time, they themselves had slaves who they didn't even see as human beings. African Americans. On November 12, 1775, George Washington decreed his orders that neither Negroes, boys unable to bear arms, nor old men could enlist in the Continental Army. But yet and still, we're conditioned through racism and social engineering, institutional racism, we're conditioned to look at George Washington as a forefather. Until this day, you have ignorant Negroes, ignorant in the term, not in the term of disrespect, but in the terms of not understanding, in the terms of just ignorance. Ignorant Negroes will say that George Washington is a forefather of theirs because they are American. Where George Washington didn't even see you as a human being, he saw you as something less than the gum beneath his feet. But on this day of 4th of July, we have to teach our people the true history of the struggle and the everyday fight of our ancestors that got us to the position that we're in now, and when we're still in the fight. So when you begin to disrespect the people of yesterday, you have to understand what they've been through and the full aspect of the fight. 2 days after the Patriots military leader banned African Americans from joining his ranks, however, black soldiers proved their mettle at the Battle of Kemp's Landing along the Virginia coast. They captured an enemy commanding officer and proved pivotal in the security for the British. After the battle, Lord Dunmore, the royal governor of Virginia, who had been forced to flee the capital of Williamsburg and formed the government in exile aboard the warship HMS Fowey, ordered the British standard raised before making a startling announcement. For the first time in public, he formally read a proclamation that he had issued the previous week granting freedom to the slaves of rebels who escaped the British custody. So this is an image of a proclamation that's explaining the black soldiers that the slaves will become soldiers in the British Army in return for their freedom. Dunmore's proclamation was more an announcement of military strategy than a pronouncement of abolitionist principles. Absolutely. Now, this is the thing. This is very important because, like I said, when I teach, I have to teach in the 360. So now you guys have to listen to this again. I'm going to reread this because I want you to listen to this because this goes along with a live stream that I did for you guys the other day. Dunmore's proclamation was more an announcement of military strategy than a pronouncement of abolitionist strategies. Now, why would they use us? We was in a position of leverage back then because the British, who was losing their colonies, needed the African slaves to fight in their war. So now they came and negotiated a deal with the slaves to say, hey, if you fight with us for us to maintain our colonies, we will grant you your freedom. So when I did the live stream last week about the Italian mafia being able to control the rackets and being able to run and become as big as they was because the CIA and the OSS, which was before the CIA, needed them. So the Italian mafia ended up having leverage. They needed the Italian mafia to go into Italy and help take down Mussolini. So now laws, those old laws, no longer apply to the Sicilian mafia because they had leverage in terms of a stronger military needing their assistance. So now with that being said, when you come to the slaves of the 1700s, those laws at that time no longer applied to them because the British government or the British crown needed them. So the slaves all of a sudden had leverage. We can join the British crown in fights and efforts of obtaining freedom, which the Patriots wasn't given at the time. So you learn this knowledge on the 4th of July. The unruly birth of democracy and the struggle to create America. The document not only provided the British with an immediate source of manpower, are y'all listening to this? It provided them with an immediate source of manpower. It weakened Virginia's patriots by depriving them of their main source, labor. So the British understood this. And the Africans being the slaves understood the leverage that they had. So let's go down. much like Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. However, Dunmore's proclamation was limited in scope. Careful not to alienate Britain's white loyalist allies, the measure applied only to slaves whose masters were in rebellion against the crown. The British regularly returned slaves who fled from their loyalist masters. So they're saying that those who rebelled against the crown, those slaves were granted freedom. But some of the colonies remained loyal to the British loyalists. So those slaves wasn't offered the freedom. Now, like I told you, the British still was racist. But at the end of the day, we still had leverage. Because a lot of us was able to navigate and still get out and camouflage and move in with the different regiments. As I read on to break this down. Dunmore Proclamation inspired thousands of slaves to risk their lives in search for freedom. They swarmed, dog paddled, and rowed to Dunmore's floating government in exile in the Chesapeake Bay in order to find protection with British forces. So now one would come and they would disrespect the black slaves who fought in these governments, but they was never a slave. Some of the people that's talking today was never a slave. We don't know what it's like to be a slave, the conditions, the harsh conditions. And now a military or the British Crown will say, we would grant you freedom if you come and fight on our behalf. These men came in droves. They wanted to liberate their children. By mid-1776, would have been a small stream of escaping slaves now turned into a torrent, wrote Nash. Over the next 7 years, enslaved Africans mounted the greatest slave rebellion in American history. Among those slaves making a break for freedom were 8 belonging to Peyton Randolph, Speaker of the Virginia House of Burgess, and several belonging to the Patriot orator Patrick Henry, who apparently took his famous words, "Give me liberty or give me death." Now here you have a man that's famous for saying, "Give me liberty or give me death," but he owned black bodies. He controlled black minds. He controlled slaves. He didn't see the liberty or the death for the black bodies that he put in those rice fields every day. But yet still, we're trained and we're conditioned to celebrate this 4th of July, where a lot of us didn't understand 4th of July. We was conditioned to just celebrate the forefathers. We was celebrated. We was conditioned to regurgitate Patrick Henry. Give me liberty or give me death. When Patrick Henry was the devil. Patrick Henry was no friend of the African. But we was conditioned to use his terms and his words. Give me liberty and give me death. Another runaway who found sanctuary with Dunmore was Harry Washington, who escaped from Mount Vernon, while his famous master led the Continental Army, who was George Washington. George Washington himself, Harry Washington, got the hell out of there. And he got out of there with the goddamn last name Washington. Dunmore placed these black loyalists in the newly formed Ethiopian Regiment. And had the words "liberty to slaves" embroiled on their uniform sashes, since the idea of escaped slaves armed with guns stirred terror among white loyalists. Dunmore placated the slaveholders by primarily using the runaways as labor, building forts, bridges, and trenches, and engaging in trades such as shoemaking, blacksmith, and carpentry. Women worked as nurses, cooks, and seamstresses. As manpower issues grew more dire as the war progressed, however, the British Army became more amenable to arming runaway slaves and sending them into battle. General Henry Clinton organized the all-black regiment, the Black Pioneers. Among the hundreds of runaway slaves in his ranks was Harry Washington, whose rose to the ranks of corporal and participated in the siege of Charleston. It's a shame that the numbers will drop when we're teaching this kind of stuff where it should be actually going up, not down. But hey, Thank you for the ones that are participating and want to know the history of their shit, our history. On June 30th, 1779, Clinton expanded on Dunmore's actions and issued the Philipsburg Proclamation, which promised protection and freedom to all slaves in the colony who escaped from the Patriot masters. Now, as the war is taking its turn and the British is losing its colonies, the British said, fuck that. Anybody who escaped bondage can come get their freedom. Anybody. Blacks captured fighting for the enemy, however, will be sold into bondage. So you got to understand something. Thank you, Alpha. You got to understand something. We was not only fighting for our freedom, but we was also Lord Nerm and Brother Alabama OG fighting with the understanding that if we got caught in battle after we escaped, we would be sold back into bondage. Do you understand this? Our people was escaping slavery and going into battle against their former slave masters with the understanding that if they was caught, they would be thrust and sold back into bondage. So can you imagine the level of fighting that these people were fighting for? They would rather die than go back into bondage. I'm going back in a body bag. That's why these regiments were so dangerous. And we're going to get into the regiments today. According to Maya Jansoff in her book Liberty Exiles, American Loyalists in the Revolutionary World, approximately 20,000 black slaves joined the British American Revolution. In contrast, the historians estimate that only about 5,000 served in the Continental Army. So now thousands ran. As the American Revolution came to close with the British defeat at Yorktown in 1781, white loyalists and thousands of their slaves evacuated Savannah and Charleston and resettled in Florida. Now I want y'all to listen to this. They evacuated Savannah and Charleston and resettled in Florida and on the plantations in Bahamas, Jamaica, and other British territories throughout the Caribbean. And this is in 1781. So you had slaves that had been here since 1555, all the way up through the 1600s in South Carolina, the Charlestons, and all these different places was taken. Before they even named South Carolina, they had slaves in different places. They were taken from the Americas down into the Caribbean. So when you go and you talk about, well, them people from Jamaica ain't my people, I'm gonna politely tell you to shut the fuck up. You don't know what the hell you're talking about, and I'm gonna know you're ignorant, and I'm gonna know you're not well studied. And when I first came on with the George Macon One channel, I used to deal with the history a lot, and I really got away from that. Now I'm getting back to it because there's a lot of ignorance, and I have to back up some of the things that I say. And I want to give a shout out to the NBK channel, Brother Danny, because I learned a lot, learning sitting under Brother Danny, getting a lot of information. Some things that I did know already, but some things he clarifies it and breaks it down so good for the brother. But I'm gonna tell you guys, when some of you Jamaicans, some of you Haitians, we ain't the same people. I'm gonna politely tell you to shut the fuck up because you don't know what the hell you're talking about. You just don't know what you're talking about. You don't know history. That's the only way I can say it. The subsequent peace negotiations called for all slaves who escaped behind British lines before November 1782 to be freed with restitution given to their owners. In order to determine which African Americans were eligible for freedom and which weren't, the British verified the names, ages, and dates of escape for every runaway slave in their custody and recorded the information in what was called the Book of Negroes. So y'all got to get that now because this is important for your reparations argument. The Book of Negroes. This is how they determined who would be able to go free and who would have to go back through the Book of Negroes. How many of y'all heard of the? Put a 1 in the chat if you heard of the Book of Negroes before. Put a 2 in the chat if you never heard of the Book of Negroes. Now put a 1 in the chat if you heard of the Book of Negroes. Put a 2 in the chat if you never heard of the Book of Negroes. When their certificates for freedom in hand, with their certificates of freedom in hand, 3,000 black men, women, and children joined the Loyalist exodus from New York to Nova Scotia. In 1783, there the black Loyalists found freedom, but little else. After years of economic hardship and denial of the land and provisions they had been promised, nearly half of the black Loyalists abandoned the Canadian province. Approximately 400 sailed to London. Now I want y'all to listen to this, because this is important. Over 3,000, it was really more than 3,000, because we got to remember, they say that 3,000 went to Nova Scotia. But then thousands of them went to Florida and the Caribbean too. Right? But then we have ones that go into Nova Scotia. And it's cold. They was given like bad land, because the white Loyalists that left America that went to Canada was given the best land. We was given rocky land where we couldn't really grow food. So 400 of those 3,000 black Loyalists went to London. So now when you see me on there with people like brothers like Richie and those guys, and you see those brothers on there, what you get now is thousands of brothers and sisters that's from London. I mean, that came in, that's originally from the Americas, that went to Canada, that end up going to London in the 1700s, that's been there forever. They didn't, not the Windrush, but they've been there forever. So now when you see me and Richie over in the UK talking, who's to say that he's not the descendants of those people that was in South Carolina, that went to Canada, ended up in London? See what I'm saying? See how the history goes in the 360 and it shows you how they moved us around? Now let's look at it. While in 1792, more than 1,200 brought their stories full circle and returned to Africa and the new settlement of Sierra Leone. Among the newly relocated was the former slaves of the newly elected president of the United States, Harry Washington, who returned to the land of his birth. So let's get to the black regiments. Let's move over to the black pioneers, the black regiments. So they asking the black loyalists, who were the black loyalists, and who was their military? Was the black loyalists just some type of punks, or was they people kicking up dust? Let's find out. The most famous of the black loyalist military units were the black pioneers and guides. Divided into a number of different corps attached to larger armies, they served the scouts, raiders, and what we could today call military engineers. Their diverse situations mean that records of their activities are scarce. For the most part, they weren't treated as standard regiments, but were instead divided into small companies and assigned as needed to various units. Now, let's keep listening. For the most part, hold on a second. For the most part, they dug fortifications and built huts and accommodations. While not a fighting unit, they would have often been called on to work under heavy fire and in the most dangerous conditions. In the record books of their arrival in Port Roseway, they are divided into companies about 30 men each. Among the pioneers were the most numerous black unit. Wait a minute. Yeah. Although the pioneers were the most numerous black unit, the Black Brigade were more daring in action. This small band of elite guerrillas raided and conducted assassinations across New Jersey. A former slave known as Colonel Tide, one of the original leaders of the Ethiopian regiment, was the man who led them. Ty survived the famine and sickness of that regiment and returned to fight in his native Monmouth County, New Jersey, exacting revenge against his old slave master and his friends. The colonel was honorific. The British never formally commissioned black officers, but sometime informally bestowed or perhaps allowed others to give them official titles. Now, mind you, this is the thing. The Black Brigade. Look up the Black Brigade. These brothers was going in guerrilla warfare, kicking up dust all through Jersey, killing former slave masters, raiding towns, running through, kicking ass. Now, one would have to ask the question as we push forward with the thirst of acquiring knowledge. Why was this never taught to us in school? Why was black boys' voice of reason never told about the Black Brigade? They was told about George Washington and how he crossed the river, but they was never told about the Black Brigade and how the Black Brigade fought diligent against the Patriot, fighting for their freedom, willing to take death rather than being put back into bondage. How come that was never taught to us? How come you never gave black boys a frame of reference of what greatness was? Of us being on the battlefield, fearless, fighting for the generations to come. How come that was never told to us? Huh? The Black Loyalists fought. They all say that the Black Loyalists fought with a lot of different groups, but the Black Loyalists fought for their freedom. Let's put in this context, brother Doug. The Black Loyalists didn't give a shit about the British or the Germans or none of that. The Black Loyalists didn't want to be slaves anymore. And the British government, who was also racist and treacherous towards the Black Loyalists, was the one promising freedom. Promising freedom. So the Black Loyalists said, hey, fuck the Patriots. Let's look at this. So we get to Colonel Ty. He was the most feared loyalist in the area, raiding fearlessly through New Jersey. From the first recorded action in the Battle of Monmouth in 1778 until 1780, Ty captured patriots and much-needed supplies, and in one celebrated raid, murdered an infamous patriot named Joseph Murray. Ty and the Black Brigade first fought independently, and then in partnership with a white unit called the Queen's Rangers. The supplies they seized were vital in the survival of the Loyalists in New York. How come they never told you about General Ty? Huh? Colonel Ty. And this man fighting in efforts to free his people. During a raid on a patriot militia leader, Ty and his brigade were caught in a drawn-out battle. Eventually, they burned their targets out. But before Ty had taken a musket ball through his wrist, the wound quickly turned gangrenous. Tetanus set in, and within weeks, he died. Probably the most effective and respected black soldier of the Revolution was lost. Let's look at this. Other fighting units, this is important. Other fighting units that black loyalists served and included the Jersey Shore Volunteers, the King's American Dragons, and the Jamaica Rangers, and the Mosquito Shore Volunteers. Blacks also commonly served in the Navy as musicians in nearly all regiments. But you have to understand the Jamaicans and the Maroon people, when they fought. But we'll get to that. Let's move over here. Let's get to Sierra Leone. Let's come right down the line. Sierra Leone was one of the first locations in West Africa to attract European interests. As early as the mid 15th century, Portuguese settlers saw the Sierra Leone River as a good location to procure fresh water and food. In the decades that followed, many different European nations engaged in commerce with the peoples who lived along the coast before a notable trade of human captives began. Sierra Leone's history eventually became immersed in that of the movements of the abolition and suppression of the transatlantic slave trade. After the American Revolution, Great Britain evacuated several thousand black loyalists to different places in its empire, like London and Nova Scotia, Canada. This group was composed of former slaves who supported the British war effort or who sought refuge behind British lines. The black loyalists arrived in London, adding to existing number of Africans and their descendants, as well as some Asians in West Indies who had escaped from slavery or who had manumitted in Britain. Many of these people suffered under the terrible poverty and lack of employment and depended on public or private assistance to survive. Now, mind you, the British wasn't treating us any better, but the British, yeah, right? No, you're right, Doug. You're definitely right, brother Doug. You're definitely right. And I have to teach this on the 4th of July when we taught condition to celebrate this holiday because our people have to know this history. Our people have to know and understand this history. I'm not going to cuss because I hope that some of you can sit your children down as I do this. I'm not going to cuss no more. And because your children need to know this history. In 1786, the British Committee for the Relief of the Black Poor began its mission of soliciting charitable donations. Sounds like the Democratic Party. They want to solicit charitable donations and things that so-called help black people instead of setting us up what we can do for ourselves by establishing a colony in Sierra Leone. The province of Freedom in Sierra Leone will offer a permanent home for impoverished blacks under the protection of the British Crown and the Royal Navy, which was a lie. In 1787, the first group of about 400 men and women arrived from Great Britain. The settlement of its residents suffered a number of internal and external setbacks and nearly failed. When the conditions in Nova Scotia proved to be unfavorable for the black loyalists, there Sierra Leone was offered as a site for relocation. About 1,200 black Nova Scotians chose to move on British ships in 1792 to Sierra Leone, where they established the Freedom Colony. Although the Crown promised the settlers self-improvement and racial equality, sounds familiar, it failed to fully deliver. The settlements of the Committee for the Relief of the Black Poor in the Nova Scotians established the roots of Freedom Town, which would become the capital of Sierra Leone. Sounds similar to Liberia. And a final influx of the new residents arrived in 1800s after the Maroon Wars of Jamaica. And we're going to get to that. Because the Jamaicans rebelled against the British rule in Jamaica. In its efforts to suppress a long conflict in Jamaica, Great Britain exiled more than 500 formerly enslaved soldiers and their families to Freetown. So now you have a war, two different wars, the Maroon Wars 1 and Maroon Wars 2. And they was kicking ass. And they never really lost, but they ended up signing a treaty that the British double-crossed them and didn't honor the treaty, end up gathering up these soldiers, these fighters, and putting them on a ship and sending them to Sierra Leone, sending them to Freetown. So what we have is slaves being stolen, Akan people being stolen from Africa and shipped to Jamaica, forming maroon colonies, fighting against the British, taken from Jamaica, and sent to Sierra Leone. But some of those Maroons were people that came from the Americas after the Revolutionary War and were sent to Jamaica. This is how we've been moved around. So you have people that was our people that was sent back to Sierra Leone and Freedom Town. That's our people. The same as Liberia. Great Britain outlawed the transatlantic slave trade in 1807 and began to use the Royal Navy's West Africa Squadron to enforce its ban. The squadron was based in Freetown, which in 1808 had been made a crown colony. As the squadron patrolled and intercepted slave trading vessels all along the African coast, it landed these recaptives in Freetown. Many of these recaptives chose to remain in Sierra Leone, helping build the colony's population. The diverse sources of Freetown settlers, drawn from North America, the Caribbean, and many African nations, composed Sierra Leone's town ethnic group, the Creole, with their own unique language and cultural forms. So let's move on. Now we get to a man named Thomas Peters. Throughout the Atlantic world, enslaved men were able to gain freedom through military service. Thomas Peters displayed leadership during the American Revolution in Nova Scotia, Canada, and in Sierra Leone, West Africa. When the British offered freedom to slaves who fled their rebel American patriot masters, Thomas Peters escaped with his owner, William Campbell of Wilmington, North Carolina. Eventually, Peters made his way to New York, where he joined the Black Pioneers Company of the British Regiment of Guards and Pioneers. Wounded twice in battle, he continued to fight against the American Continental Forces until the end of the war. Thomas Peters' military service earned him a certificate of freedom and allowed him to board a British ship evacuating New York and en route to Nova Scotia in 1783. Black and white loyalists who migrated to Nova Scotia competed for land grants and other resources. So you know the blacks, even though they were loyal, when they got there, they had to compete against whites for land grants and resources. So you know they didn't get shit. Conditions were harsh. So we fought for our freedom, but the British really didn't keep all of their promises. But as a slave, anything was better than still being on them cotton fields in Mississippi. Thomas Peters pressed authorities to provide land grants that had been promised to black war veterans. Harsh conditions forced many veterans to perform road work in order to receive food rations. After the governor of Nova Scotia continued to delay land grants, Peters took action and wrote a series of petitions to government officials seeking a solution for their grievances. Frustrated with discriminations and delay, Peters decided to travel to England to advocate for the black community of Nova Scotia. When he arrived in England, he met abolitionists and members of the Sierra Leone Company. Peter negotiated with the company to allow immigrants of Nova Scotia to settle in Freetown, Sierra Leone. So now when I showed you the Sierra Leone aspect, you get to see Thomas Peters, and he was the one, him and certain other abolitionists was responsible in getting these people from the cold climates of Nova Scotia to Sierra Leone. But there's a kicker. There's a kicker. And this is where the fuckery kicks in. Peters returned to Nova Scotia with John Clarkson, brother of abolitionist Thomas Clarkson, to recruit peoples for the Freedom Town relocation with a promise of a better life, land grants, education, self-government, equality with whites, and Christian missionary work. Peters and Clarkson convinced hundreds of people to board a fleet of ships destined for Freedom Town in 1792. Upon arrival, black immigrants and Clarkson were surprised and angered to learn that the Sierra Leone's company board members had broken many of their promises. Thomas Peterson was at the forefront of leadership and protest. Thomas Peters. The crisis fractured Peters and Clarkson's relationship. In a letter, Clarkson described Peters as a troublemaker and a threat to his authority. Soon after Peters died, before he can secure a better life for those he had brought to Sierra Leone. Now, mind you, Peters was black. This is a picture of Peters. This black man was fighting for his people to give him a better life. Thomas Clarkson and them was white. They wanted to socially engineer our people under this Christianity. How did the picture just disappear? What the hell just happened? The picture just went away. All right, yeah. So yeah, the picture just disappeared. I don't know what the hell just happened. I mean, literally, the picture disappeared, y'all. Look. The picture going now. So let me show these pictures. These are pictures of the black loyalists in 1779. This is them fighting in battle. Why are these pictures disappearing? Going away. What the fuck? Let me show this one before it disappeared. What the hell? Man, they fucking with the pictures, man. Forget it, because I don't know what's going on with the pictures. They just disappearing. So it says, so now Thomas Clarkson wanted to make Freedomtown a British colony. What's going on, Info Man? They wanted to make Freedomtown a British colony, and they wanted to force Christianity on the people. So Thomas Peters was like, man, listen, later for all of that, man. You promised us freedom. You promised us a better life, land grants, self-government, equality, and all these different things. And we got there. We was to be under your foot, under a British colony again. That's what you gave us. So now John Clarkson had a fallout with Thomas Peters, and he called Peters. Now this sounds familiar. He called Peters, Brother Moses, a troublemaker. He called Peters. That sounds familiar. People that speaks up for their people still to this day is called militant or a troublemaker. So let's look at the African institution now. Let's look over here. Let's move over. What's up, Brother Moses? So after Sierra Company folded, you have what you call the African Institution. It was founded in 1807, right? After British abolitionists succeeded in the slave trade, succeeded in ending the slave trade based in the United Kingdom, the institution was formed to succeed where the former Sierra Leone Company had failed, to create a viable, civilized refuge for free slaves in Sierra Leone. Now this is the thing, though, right? Y'all have to really understand the wordplay that they use when they're doing this. They say a civilized refuge. So what you're saying, you're telling me that the Africans weren't civilized prior to you coming there to have to set up some type of civilized refuge? This is the wordplay, and this is racist in itself. And this is called the African Institution that's controlled by the British. When the Sierra Leone Company sought to first convert the native population through evangelism, the African Institution aimed to improve the standard of living in Freetown first. Rules and regulations were proposed as its meeting on April 14, 1807. One aspect of its purpose was to repair the wrongs which Native Africans had suffered in their intercourse with Europeans. The leaders of the African Institution were James Stephen, William Wilberforce, all white. The Duke of Gloucester, nephew King George III, acted as the institution's first president and was joined by clergymen and aristocrats. Leading Quaker families also became supporters, as well as Unitarians like Peter Fitch Martineau. Now, you got to understand something, why we're conditioned to love white. We're conditioned to love white Jesus in Africa, a lot of them think that getting a white woman is like close to God or a white man and all this stuff because of what they did to us. They socially engineered us through these so-called clergymen and aristocrats to believe that whites was better, and whites civilized us. This is the thing. Now we get to Paul Cuffey. The institution showed close interest with Paul Cuffey, an African American entrepreneur. In 1810, they approached the British government requesting a land grant in Sierra Leone for him. The African merchants of Freetown, Sierra Leone, were, however, prevented from getting ahead by the tight monopoly which British merchants such as Macaulay and Babington held over the Sierra Leone trade. On April 7, 1811, Cuffey met with the foremost black merchants of the colony, including the successful John Kizell. They penned a petition to the African institution stating that the colony's greatest needs were for settlers to work in agriculture, commerce, and whaling, and that these three areas would facilitate growth for the colony's best. Upon receiving this petition, the members of the institution agreed with their findings. Cuffey and these merchants together founded the Friendly Society of Sierra Leone, a local mutual aid merchant group, and dedicated the furthering prosperity and industries amongst the free peoples and the colonies and loosening the stranglehold the English merchants held on the trade. Yeah, I'm not going to stay here. Let me see. Because I got a part two coming, so I'm not going to read the whole thing. I want to save some of it in part two. I'm gonna go more into Paul Cuffey and his dealings in the Sierra Leone. I'm gonna stop that part there. We're gonna go to the Americans. We're gonna go here to the Americans. But before I go to the Americans, I'm gonna play a video and I want y'all to watch this. Let me know if the sound is right. You know, this is the 4th of July. We here, man, bringing this information. We're here to bring this information. This is vital information to our history. What I'm about to play for you guys and show you guys now is about 5 minutes of a video that's very important. You guys need this, man. If y'all can hit that Cash App on the 4th of July, man, while I'm bringing y'all this, hit it. If not, I greatly appreciate it. So I'm going to play this video, and I want y'all to see. I want you guys to see, hear what this lady is saying.
And over the 7-year period, we have been able to do a lot of awareness among American people, build awareness among our American people, and at a national level, share information. Yes, we have been here for 201 years now. Last year, we celebrated our 200th anniversary. Americans came here in 1816, and why only just recently a lot of people become aware of American history. Was it a plan? I don't know. Was it a forgotten war direction that we should keep it a secret? Well, it's no longer a secret.
The first batch of soldiers that came settled in First Company, known as Grant. And the conditions there were not really, what they had expected. And they called for New Grant. Hence the reason why the place is now called New Grant in Matilda, Cafe area. Third batch of soldiers settled in the Third Company area on the Indian Road. Fourth batch of soldiers that came, they settled around Williamsville, known as Cadbury. The fifth batch of soldiers settled around the Indian Walk Road, going to Muruga. So So that's the fifth company area there. And the sixth company is the last batch of soldiers that came and settled in the sixth company that borders or connects with the first company, second company, third company, and fifth company. So the African Americans settled in the company villages and called themselves Americans.
As we go along, you will hear more about the work of Americans.
Spoken word, oral tradition. To bring it back is the mission. In this race, take your position. Face to face, let me give them ammunition. The steel, the drums, the heartbeat. Let them feel the power of the rhythm. The rhythm is real. Now is the hour for the power to reveal.
Remember, Americans came in 1815, 16. They still had slavery. Trinidad had just become British in 1797, and these people came up 15, 18 years afterwards. In the height of slavery, and yet you were empowering black people. For me, that is the sense of pride. Yet you were empowering black people. They have already gotten their freedom in America. They have fought for it. Their land was their payment, and here it is that you were giving each family 16 acres of land to do something for themselves. Never mind it was virgin land in uncharted territory. I think that is important. I think that is special.
Let me bring back the drum. Let me bring back the rhythm then. Let me bring down the drum. Americans bring down the rhythm then. Let me bring down the drum. Let me bring to the rhythm.
Nicole Cooper. I'm a Cooper, but I'm from the Elliott. I'm Floyd Clan. Thank you.
Only plantation. Someone welcome with my body. The chairs we learn to step up.
Let me pause this for a minute now. These people are descendants of the Americans, and they call themselves the Americans down in Trinidad. And these were the people that landed there in 1816 after the War of 1812. So I wanted to play some of this. Let me move this over. So it explains the hold on a second. Let's see.
And I am very proud. We stand tall because we stand on the backs of our ancestors.
Now watch this.
We want to build churches, to create
This is
the
important.
churches, and that's one of our skills. A lot of Americans are preachers and teachers and healers and leaders who developed the American community to what it is today. And that is what I say about the great, resilient people.
I want y'all to see this last part.
Know that we are proud to be American. I am very proud to be American. I know that my foreparents fought for freedom and some died, and I am very proud. We stand tall because we stand on the backs of our ancestors. These words that you hear were intended for your ear. Now I don't want to hear that you're living in fear. I'm a little man, black and proud. I'm living in the ghetto and I do first no from.
All right, that's enough of that. I wanted to play that because I wanted you guys to see. I wanted you guys to see in Trinidad just who the Americans were. Now we're going to read it. We're going to read up before we get out of here. All right, so it says the Americans or Americans were African American Marines of the War of 1812, former African slaves who fought for the British against the U.S. and the corps of colonial Marines, and then after the First War service in Bermuda, was established a community in south of Trinidad in 1815 to 16. They were settled in areas populated by French-speaking Catholics and retained cohesion in an English-speaking Baptist community. It is sometimes said in the term Americans derived from the local Patias. But as many Americans have been long have long been in the habit of dropping initial A, um, it seems more likely in the newsletter brought the pronunciation from them from the United States. Uh, they call themselves Americans. Some of the company villages and land grants established back then still exist in Trinidad to this day. So you gotta understand something. When we come on the 4th of July, I got 25 people watching. Thanks for the people that really want this knowledge, man. Because I'm gonna tell you something. I'm gonna say I'm really learning the more and more we go through protest and teach that a lot of our people don't care nothing about this stuff. You know, and it sounds kind of harsh. A lot of people get out and protest, but when you teach them the information of why what the protest is about, they don't want the information. They want to continue to keep being tricked by the enemy. Now, what I want to see in the chat room, I want people to be truthful. If you ever heard of the Americans, put a one in the chat. If you didn't, put a two in the chat. Everybody watching right now, just the people here that's watching. If you heard of the Americans, put one in the chat. If you didn't, put a two. Because they wasn't teaching this stuff in school to black boys and black girls. But we understood our history. We understood that our people here in the Americas fought with the British Navy in the War of 1812. They wasn't teaching us this stuff. You can come across YouTube and black YouTube. Nobody's going to tell you about this stuff except for MBK and Brother Danny and them. See what I'm saying? All the tubes coming in. Nobody never heard of this. And one would have to ask the question, why? Why? Why they never told us this stuff, man? They got us going around screaming back and forth ADOS, and they got people in the Caribbean saying, I'm not like those blacks in America. We the same goddamn people. See what I'm saying? This is the stuff that they're doing to us. We're being used like guinea pigs, man, experiments, man. They playing with us, man. During the American Revolution, the British recruited freedom to service, freedom for service as colonial marines. During the War of 1812, there was a policy that was somewhat similar, except that freedmen were treated as free as soon as they came into British hands. There were no conditions, no bargains attached to recruitment. 6 companies of freedmen were recruited, and a corps of colonial marines along the Atlantic coast from Chesapeake Bay to Georgia. After that war, the British settled these colonial marines in British Empire colonies in, again, Canada, Jamaica, and the Bahamas. Vice Admiral Sir Alexander Cochrane, on taking over the command of British forces in North America, stationed in 1814, issued a proclamation offering a choice of enlistment or resettlement. All who may be disposed to immigrate from the United States will, with their families, be received on a board of His Majesty's ships or vessels of war, or at the military posts that may be established upon or near the coast of the United States, when they will have their choice of either entering into His Majesty's Sea of Land Forces or being set free settlers to the British possessions in North America or West Indies, where they will meet with due encouragement. So now watch this. So now these so-called African Americans that fought in this war, many of them went to the West Indies and amalgamated there with the people. So now they got us today, CARICOM, Jamaicans, people in St. Lucia, different places. They're saying here in America, we ain't the same people. They ain't my people. They look down on us, and I'm like, wait a fucking minute. What are we doing? What are we talking about? We are the same people. Why are we teaching this stuff? But you won't come get it from George. And like I said last week when I was standing outside my barbershop, anybody feel froggish, take the leap. I'm going to mash and smash you. I'm telling you now. Because a lot of stuff that I talk about, I don't even talk about on YouTube. I'm just starting to show stuff. But if you feel like you want to jump and do a backflip and into the ring, when I hit you with the Garvin stuff, don't be mad. Don't be making videos about me. But if you feel like you want to take up for the white man and do all this, come on with your books, and let's see if you survive. Because there's so much stuff that people don't know. People don't understand, know how to. Yeah, thanks, Doug, for putting MBK's link in the chat, man. Subscribe, everybody watching, man. Subscribe to MBK, man. Brother Danny, man. Brother Danny is, man. Goddamn. You know what I mean? You know, he bring the information. He bring the heat, man. At the end of the war, the Colonial Marines was first stationed at the Royal Navy's dockyards in Bermuda. Although they had signed on for a military military life, they rejected the government's order to be transferred to the West Indies regiments and finally agreed to be settled in Trinidad and Tobago. The governor of Trinidad, Sir Ralph Water, wanted to increase the number of small farmers in that colony and arranged for the creation of the village for each company in the Norfolk Plain in the south of the island. Local planter Robert Mitchell managed the establishment and maintenance of the settlers, petitioning the governor for supplies when needed. Company Village. Hold on. Let's look at it. Unlike the American refugees who were brought to Trinidad in 1815 in the ships of the Royal Navy, HMS Cairn and HMS Levant. The veteran Marines were brought there in 1816 with their families and hired in the hired transports of Mary and Dorothy of Lord Eldon. There were 574 former soldiers, plus about 200 women and children. To balance the sexes, more black women were subsequently recruited, and women had been freed from other places such as captured French slave ships. The six companies were each settled in a separate village under the command of a corporal sergeant who maintained a military style of discipline. Some of the villages were named after the companies, and the fifth and sixth company villages still remain those names. Now, what you got to remember, when they took us down there, we were still up under them, but we were free. But this is where you get the coon stuff from. This is where you get where we look at white people as something greater than us because, man, we've been through a hard road as a people. This has been a hard. What's up, Kenny? This has been a hard road, man. The villages were in a forested area of the Parma Plain near a former Spanish mission, La Mission de Savannah Grande. Each of the veterans Marines were granted 16 acres of land, and some of these plots are still farmed today by descendants of the original settlers. Now, in that video that I showed you, it was a lady walking around showing the 16 acres of land that her great grandparents was given, and they were still growing fruit and vegetables on those acres of land. But this has me now wanting to visit Trinidad. The land was fertile, unlike the land that was given to the freed slaves of Nova Scotia. Because remember, now this came after all of that. So this company was treated better than the first slaves that actually fought. So let's look on. The land was fertile, but conditions were primitive initially, as the land had to be cleared, and the lack of roads was a special problem. It is sometimes said that some of the settlers were craftsmen, more used to an urban environment, as they had been expecting better. They were disgruntled, and some returned to America, right? But this comment applies to later free black American settlers who came from towns and not from veteran colonial Marines who were all refuge. Wait a minute, let me make this bigger so I can see it. Crazy. All right, here we go. So I can see it. But this comment applies to later free black American settlers who came from towns and not to the veteran colonial Marines who were all refugees from rural areas of the Chesapeake and Georgia. So the ones that was complaining was the ones that came from towns, information man. They didn't come from the rural areas in the backwoods. The blacks that came from the backwoods wasn't complaining because they was used to it. They was used to it. So we got to put that in its proper context. The settlers built houses from timber they fell in planting crops of bananas, cassava, maize, and potatoes. Rice was introduced from America and was especially useful because it was stored for long periods without spoiling. 20 years after the initial establishment, the then governor, Lord Harris, supported improvements to the infrastructure of the settlements and arranged for the settlers to get deeds for their lands. So confirming their property rights as originally stated on arrival. Though it is not clear that the initiative was carried through universally, as they prospered, they became a significant element in Trinidad's economy. Their agriculture advanced from subsistence farming to include cash crops and cocoa and sugarcane. Later, the oil was discovered, and then some descendants were able to lease their lands to for mineral rights. Others continue as independent market traders. So this is a situation that happened in Trinidad. And don't get me wrong, racism was still big in Trinidad because as we come forward, I've done live streams on the Black Power history of Trinidad and the wars that went on in Trinidad. But this is an aspect of people that disrespect black soldiers that fought in the Revolutionary War because we have to understand the impact the Revolutionary War had on the black people. Not just the freedom, Patrick Henry's freedom of death, and what it had for whites, but what was the impact of the Revolutionary War for the black man? The untold history, that's the untold truth, and the untold history that's never been told. So let me get to the last part. Many of the original settlers were Baptists from evangelical sects, common in places such as Georgia and Virginia. Uh-oh. So you're telling me that they took people from Georgia and all the way up to Virginia and sent them to Trinidad? But we're running around saying we're not the same people. Okay. From now on, I'll just sit on the sideline and just listen and laugh. The settlers kept this religion, which was reinforced by missionary work by Baptists from London who helped organize the construction of churches in 1840. The villages had pastors and other religious elders as authority figures, and they were a rigorous moral code of abstinence and a Puritan work ethic. African traditions were influential too, and these included the Gayap system of communal health, herbal medicine of Obeah, African traditional science. A prominent leader in the 20th century was Papa Nezer, Samuel Ebenezer Eliot, who was a descendant of the original George Eliot and renowned for his ability to heal and cast out demons, spirits. His oh shit, man, yeah, I ain't. So let's see, his centric form of religion included veneration of Shango prophecies from the OBC and the revelation of Psalms, the spiritual Baptist faith, and the legacy of the American community. So all this stuff is important when you're dealing with the Americans. Now I'm pushing Brother Danny to come and do on the channel a presentation on the Americans and the importance of how Christianity and the love of white Jesus, how strong it was, because you got to understand something. They took colonies and created colonies with black people and gave them freedom, gave them land, allowed them to grow their own food, allowed them to have certain practices free and land of their own. But then they brought in the religion. So when you see it's so hard for us to break these spiritual chains, now you get a chance to understand. Now you get a chance to understand why it's so hard for us to break this religion. because this stuff has been on our people for so long. They use so many different tactics to keep us under the yoke of Christianity and white Jesus by allowing us to create certain colonies and still giving us limited resources. But even in the limited resources, based off of our conditions, it was a lot. But a lot of people never even heard of the War of 1812, let alone the Americans that fought in the War of 1812, that was taken from America to the Caribbean, given free land. That was given free land in Bermuda. Not understanding that Bermuda is the largest black population in Bermuda is the largest population. We don't know the history. So we get on and we blab and we run our mouths and we criticize the people of the past, but we don't know the real history. We just don't know the real history. So this concludes this stream today. Um, for the day, I want to thank those that stayed to get this information. Um, I have more coming. I'm going to restream. I'm going to reach out to my brother Moses, and I'm going to restream the Coon character that me and Moses did a year ago, and a year and a half ago, something like that. We're going to restream the Coon character, and then I got another stream coming about blacks that fought in different wars for part two to this. So look forward, man. We're going to get it in. We definitely won't get it in, man. I'm recharged. I'm in my bag. Um, and yeah, we want to talk about some different stuff. So look forward to that. So remember, I love my people more than they hate themselves, and I pray to the universal creator most high that these words are enough to inspire you. These words are enough to make you look at yourself in the mirror and make change. These words are enough to make you look at your children and know you have to make change. I hope that when you came here for information, and when you leave here greater than what you was before you came. We got the Urban Nerds channel up. We want to start uploading content to it very soon. I have my foundation together now. The Urban Nerd. I have the Urban Nerds Worldwide um, production company, but now I have the Urban Nerds Foundation. Yeah. I have all that together with the 501c3. Um, we're going to be getting donations. Like I said, we may be in a city near you. It's coming. I was just getting all the paperwork together. We're gonna be taking these kids around the country, man, to different black sites, man. We're gonna have black and Puerto Rican kids, um, and we're gonna be moving around. Urban Nerds, man. Look forward to it. It's coming. It's coming. It's finally it's finally here, man. I'm gonna be selling the Urban Nerd shirts. So make sure you guys get a shirt. Give me about another week or so. Everything is gonna take off. You welcome, Doug. But I just wanted on this 4th of July, I want to teach you a history of our people that you don't know. That they're not gonna teach you in school. And like I said, this type of history that will really liberate us. Just know our people are not interested in this kind of stuff because they're conditioned. They're in a conditioned mind. That's why I say I love my people more than they hate themselves, and I mean it because I understand the condition of self hate. Most of our people are in denial about it, but let's just keep it real. So look forward, man, to me coming back with the Coon character, and I got some other stuff. I have some other stuff. Thank you for the cash app, Stephanie. Thank you so much. I have some other stuff ready to drop. So I might come back in another hour or so and do another live stream on another lady, man. This powerful lady. So I'm in a history mood. All right, man. So I'll see y'all later. Peace.